Please join me responsibly in the prayer for guidance. Living God, through the reading of the Scriptures and by the power of your Spirit, may we hear for ourselves the good news and believe.
And live because of your word, that Jesus Christ gives us a new way of understanding ourselves. Amen.
So this morning, as we have continued on through this series of discovering our identity in God, we get to this place this morning where we're going to discuss about when other people label us. And it's one of those things where if we think about the labels that we have, even on ourselves, maybe that we've given ourselves or that somebody has given us, they can be really kind of complex, right? Because not all labels are negative. In fact, there are some times where we want labels. I love having the label of pastor. I love that label. I do. And it's one of those things of we can think about those things that we've even worked hard for to even take that label on, that we want it, and so we worked hard for it and we got it. And then there are the labels, right, that are really kind of problematic, that can really hurt, that feel like they might stifle us or that they cause some kind of pain. And it's interesting because if we think about those labels in our lives, about how much our identity gets wrapped around and how much labels can even wrap up our identity, there's really a lot of power in them, even though they are just words. But they are powerful, powerful words. And so the story that we're going to look at is the story of Rahab. And the story of Rahab comes at the point, last week we talked about Joshua and him having to lead the people, the Israelites, into the promised land that God had promised the Israelite people out of Egypt. And here we find them, they have crossed into the land, and they are now proceeding to engage cities and people in war. They are conquering the land. Now that may make us feel pretty uncomfortable. We're like, whoa, wait a minute. Like God's like, hey, go conquer these people. But we need to know a little bit of history on this one and a little bit of archaeology. It's kind of interesting when we look at the narrative of how Joshua leads the people into the land, and then each of the cities they begin to conquer. Now, scholars can kind of pinpoint a couple of different periods of time where it was possible that the Exodus could have taken place in context to other pieces of history. What's really interesting is that the list of cities that's given in the story of Joshua, they conquered here and they conquered there. When you go back and look at the archaeology of those sites, some of those cities were never destroyed. Some of those cities were destroyed at very different periods of time than what would have been acceptable through the Joshua conquest or the time period that could have kind of taken place. Like, they are so far off. And so you begin to wonder that maybe what's going on is that these conquests are literary devices that are used to speak of how the Israelites come into this land that they were afraid to enter, and now they have to begin to conquer their fears. They have to begin to conquer their fears with other people. And so they face these cities and these other individuals, these other communities that already exist, and they have to conquer their fear instead of destroying other people. And so as we look at the passage this morning, I really want us to keep that kind of lens. Instead of seeing Joshua and what he did as a conquering force, to begin to see it as the Israelite people are beginning to face their fears. They're beginning to conquer their fears. They're beginning to see a new life in the land that maybe they really hadn't expected. And so the story of Rahab comes at this moment that the Israelite army is outside of the walls of Jericho, and the city of Jericho was supposed to be this massive place where these walls they couldn't get through, that they were a city that no one could conquer. And so here the Israelites are and they're trying to figure out how to deal with the city of Jericho. And Rahab is a citizen of Jericho. She inhabits that place. And so with her story, let us begin to unwind those labels and those preconceived notions and how we understand our identity. Beginning in Joshua 2. Joshua, Nun's son, secretly sent 2 men as spies from Shittim. He said, "Go, look over the land, especially Jericho." They set out and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab. They bedded down there. Someone told the king of Jericho, "Men from the Israelites have come here tonight to spy on the land." So the king of Jericho sent word to Rahab, "Send out the men who came to you, the ones who came to your house, because they have come to spy on the entire land."
But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them.
Then she said, "Of course the men came to me, but I didn't know where they were from. The men left when it was time to close the gate at dark, but I don't know where the men went."
Hurry, chase after them. You might catch up with them.
So from the very moment we get this label on Rahab, Rahab the prostitute. And so we get from that label, right, we all have preconceived notions about what that entails. We all have preconceived notions about who she is when that label is applied to her. And it seems that so does everybody else, right? So the spies come to her, they hide there, and then the king's men come and they show up, and she goes, "Of course they were here." Right? Of course, that's what, yes. And so the king's men are like, "Oh yeah, I guess they were." So it's one of those things where a label here, a label that many are using to doubt who Rahab is, who doesn't fully understand who Rahab is, she is able to use that label in a way that others underestimate her. And so throughout our lives, have we had that experience of having labels put on us that almost, they consume everything that we are, so that people say, "Well, you're only that"? How often have we placed labels on someone else where that's what we've reduced them to? That they are only that one thing. How often have we struggled with a label that people can't seem to see past it? Rahab had taken them up to the roof and hidden them under the flax stalks that she had laid out on the roof. The men from Jericho chased after them in the direction of the Jordan up to the fords. As soon as those chasing them went out, the gate was shut behind them. Before the spies bedded down, Rahab went up to them on the roof.
She said, "Now I have been loyal to you, so pledge to me by the Lord that you in return will deal loyalty with my family. Give me a sign of good faith.
Spare the lives of my father, mother, brothers, and sisters, along with everything they own. Rescue us from death." The men said to her, "We swear by our own lives to secure yours. If you don't reveal our mission, we will deal loyally and faithfully with you when the Lord gives us the land." So in this moment, who we think Rahab is, if we were just to say Rahab the prostitute, would we have assumed that she has this love and this care for her family to the point that she is willing to negotiate with people she doesn't know, an invading army? She's willing to negotiate with them to save her family. Sometimes when we place those labels, we begin to stifle who someone is. We begin to stifle ourselves. And so it's this real moment of seeing beyond Rahab the prostitute, of what we think we know she does, what we think she knows her, what we think we know of her work, and we begin to see beyond this sense of wanting life. of wanting life cultivated, of wanting her family to be saved, of wanting to even give life to these men who are about to invade the place that she lives. It's this sense that life becomes stronger than any label that has been placed. And in this moment, we see the spies recognizing that something unexpected has happened, that they realize that she cares more for life than anything that they preconceived or prejudged, that she cares more about life, and that is a connection to be made. And so for us, when we think about those labels that we put on others, when we put on ourselves, when we allow others to put on us, how does it stifle life or create life? How does it begin to build us up or take us down? How does it begin to work into our identities? How does life play a part? And it's really interesting to be having this conversation as the world around us feels like it's coming to a halt, that there is so much fear, that people aren't unsure of what's going to happen, that the world just feels off. I mean, it could be that it was full moon Friday the 13th and somebody played the game Jumanji, but, right? But, as we sense what's going on, and it's so easy to start to point fingers at people of you should have done this, you should have done that, to knock people out of the way for toilet paper. Who thought we'd be knocking each other out for toilet paper, right? Right. But of being very careful about how we begin to place labels on others when we see somebody who has a cart full and we think you hoarder you, when in actuality they may be buying for everyone in their family who can't come out of the door. And so it's this moment of really being careful about how we begin to see the people around us. Do we begin to fear the people around us? Do we begin to put that label on others? Or do we step back and say, wait a minute, I'm not so sure. Maybe I need a little bit more information. Because how often has somebody put a label on us and I am not that? Has anybody ever called you something or said, this is who you are, and you're like, ho, back that train up, right? Right? We don't like it when people do it to us. And so it's this moment of realizing how careful we have to be. That are the labels that we so easily toss out or that we put on ourselves or allow others to put on us, is there life there or not? How is life playing into this discussion? Now to Joshua. So she lowered the spies on a rope through the window. Her house was on the outer side of the city wall, and she lived inside the wall. Then she said to them,
Go toward Zion, so that those chasing you don't run into you.
hide there for 3 days until those chasing you return, then you may go on your way. Life. Whatever those boundaries, preconceived notions of one another, in this moment, we see that life is being cultivated. Because their identities are becoming wrapped around something very different. That even though Rahab is going to continue to have this label of Rahab the prostitute, that her identity is becoming wrapped up in something so completely different. The men said to her, we won't be responsible for this pledge you made us swear unless, when we come into the land, you tie this red woven cord in the window through which you lowered us.
Gather your father, your mother, your brothers, and your whole family into the house with you.
Those who go outside the doors of your house into the street will have only themselves to blame for their own deaths. We won't be on those who are with you in the house. We will take the blame for their deaths. But if you reveal our mission, we won't be responsible for this pledge you made us swear." She said,
"These things will happen just like you said." She sent them away, and they went off. Then she tied a red cord in the window.
it's like this whole negotiation, right? That they're both saying, we want to cultivate life here, but we still don't truly know who you are. And it's that moment of taking a step back and saying, okay, we recognize that we need to put some parameters around this. And it's that sense, right, that when we come across people who maybe are destructive, that we do have to put parameters. There's a reason for a particular label. But with that, not that we need to be putting ourselves necessarily in danger, but it is that sense that everybody has the chance to be redeemed. That we put these parameters, but show us that you want life. Show us that you want that. It's that sense that when we begin to wrap our identity around God, when we begin to wrap our identity around life, that we begin to make space. We begin to make space for new possibilities. We begin to make space that people have things about them that are good and wonderful. We just may not always know it. We begin to make space for redemption. We begin to make space for that grace to come in. We begin to make space for new possibilities. My guess is we've all felt that sense of wanting to prove ourselves at some point. Maybe we've screwed something up, or maybe we just haven't had the chance, and so we want to prove that, no, I can do whatever it is. No, I can turn my life around. And so it's this moment of going, okay, we've got parameters here, but we're going to give space to saying, is it possible? And here we shall see that both parties are interested in cultivating life, that both are not afraid of the labels that each of them has, that they're both willing to look up beyond to see if there is something more. Joshua spoke to the two men who had scouted out the land.
Go to the prostitute's house. Bring out the woman from there, along with everyone who gave to her, exactly as you pledged to her.
So the young men who had been spies went and brought Rahab out, along with her father, her mother, her brothers, and everyone related to her. They brought her whole clan out and let them stay outside Israel's camp. So in this moment, we've got them. We've got that they have now cultivated life on both sides, that the parameters worked, that there was something beyond. Yet she still has this label of prostitute, and you kind of wonder, because even throughout the scriptures, whenever she gets mentioned, it will say Rahab the prostitute, and you kind of wonder about that. Like, is it a way to say to keep her down? Or is it a way of saying, you think you know somebody, but look what else she did? Because it's important for us to know that what Rahab is going to do, Rahab is going to be in the lineage of King David. Rahab is going to be in the lineage of Jesus. She is named in Matthew 1. She is part of Jesus' heritage, of Jesus' history, of that sense of we're all in this together. It is this moment of saying, yeah, you may have that label, that particular label, but there is so much more to you. And so for ourselves, as we go through these days, not only how we look at the labels that have been placed upon us, how we want to break free of those labels, but also how we are placing labels on others. Do we stop at one? Do we just stop at Rahab the prostitute? Or do we look beyond and see Rahab who gives life? Who gives life to Jesus? How are labels impacting us? And how are we going to use them going forward? Because when fear begins to take root, just like the fear of the Israelites going into the land, God goes, and you don't get to go in the promised land. You guys are fearful. You get 40 more years of wandering in the desert. When that fear takes hold, we begin to not make the decisions that necessarily give life. And so as we go through these days where we're more socially distancing just because we have to give that space for healing, as we do that, let us be mindful of the labels that we want to throw out. Let us be mindful of the labels that somebody may want to be placed upon us, and understand them in the context of a God who keeps calling for grace, who keeps calling for love, who keeps calling for life renewed. How will the labels that we use, how will the labels that we allow cultivate life? As we think about that, I'd like for us to listen to this song by King and Country called God Only Knows.